Mark Consuelos had it all. The career, the marriage, the family, the kind of life most people only ever imagine. Then one day, without any warning, everything changed. The man millions watched on their screens every morning suddenly looked different behind closed doors. Quieter. Heavier. Like something inside him had simply gone dark. So what happened to Mark Consuelos at 55 that broke him so deeply? And why has he never quite been the same since? It starts long before the cameras, long before the fame. Mark did not become the man he is by accident. The values he carried into his marriage, his career, his family, they all came from one place. Home. And at the center of that home was his father. Not a loud man. Not a flashy one. But the kind of man whose influence settles into you slowly, quietly, over decades. Discipline. Loyalty. Showing up for the people who need you. These were not lessons spoken in speeches. They were lessons lived out, every single day, right in front of him. Mark watched his father move through life with a steady calm. Nothing reckless, nothing dramatic. Just a man who took his responsibilities seriously and expected the same from those around him. And that example never left Mark. Even as his world became loud and public and full of distraction, those quiet lessons traveled with him everywhere. It is why, even at the peak of his success, Mark never seemed drawn to the more excessive corners of celebrity life. He stayed grounded, kept his circle small, protected what mattered. But here is where it gets painful, because the man who gave him all of that was eventually going to be gone. And when that moment arrived, nothing could have prepared him for it. Losing his father did not just mean losing a parent. It meant losing the original source of everything he had built his life around. And grief has a strange, cruel way of making itself known. It does not wait for a quiet moment. It surfaces everywhere, in a song, in a smell, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Suddenly, you are back inside a moment that no longer exists. That was the world Mark found himself living in. His mind kept returning to conversations that had seemed unremarkable at the time. Advice he had been given but not fully absorbed. Ordinary moments that had never felt precious until now, when they were all he had left. Because that is what grief does. It takes the everyday and makes it feel sacred. The things you never thought to hold on to become the things you reach for most. And Mark found himself replaying memories he had not revisited in years. Times his father had shown up quietly without being asked. Simple things said in passing that now carried an impossible weight. Comforting and devastating at exactly the same time. But beneath the sadness, something else was beginning to stir, something quieter and harder to admit than grief alone. Regret. For a lot of people, loss does not arrive as sadness alone. It arrives with questions tucked underneath. Questions about the years spent building a career, keeping up with the relentless pace of an industry, maintaining a public life, and whether all of that had quietly taken time away from the person who mattered most. Success asks a lot of a person. It pulls at your attention, your energy, your presence. And it rarely signals clearly when it has asked for too much. Mark had always said family came first. But valuing something and being fully present for it are not always the same thing. And that gap, once visible, is very hard to look away from. He was not alone in feeling this. Most people never let themselves ask this question out loud because the answer is uncomfortable. But the loss had made it impossible to avoid. And as those feelings built inside him, people close to Mark began noticing a side of him they had never seen before. Quieter. More withdrawn. Carrying something he was not willing to show the world. And what happened next, nobody expected. Mark kept going. He kept showing up. On the outside, the composure held. But the people who knew him well could see something very different behind it. Because grief does not vanish simply because someone refuses to discuss it. If anything, when it has nowhere to go, it sits heavier. Mark processed things internally, the way he always had, turning everything over again and again without releasing the pressure. And that kind of grief is exhausting in a way that is almost impossible to explain. The hardest parts were the smallest ones. A routine with a gap in it now. A moment in the day when he would normally have picked up the phone. A habit that had existed for decades and suddenly had nowhere to go. Those ordinary reminders hit harder than anyone expected. His public image remained steady because Mark made sure it did. But behind that steady image was a man who was emotionally worn down, carrying far more than anyone watching from the outside could see. And while he was struggling, one person refused to look away. Kelly Reaper stepped closer. not back. And that is not something everyone knows how to do. When someone you love is grieving, the instinct is often to give them space, to wait until they are ready. But Kelly seemed to understand that space was not what Mark needed. He needed someone present, consistently, without making it feel complicated. She shifted her attention entirely onto him, not in a dramatic way, but in the small practical ways that actually matter. Checking in without pressure, sitting with him without needing to fill every silence, being available without asking him to manage her feelings on top of his own. There is a particular kind of support that does not try to fix anything. It just holds steady and stays present. That was what Kelly offered. She knew him well enough to know when to talk and when to say nothing at all. She also gave him something else, something rarer, permission to stop pretending he was fine. And that mattered more than most people realize. Being told by someone whose opinion genuinely counts to you that you do not have to hold it all together can be the thing that finally allows the grief to begin moving. Mark leaned on her in ways he perhaps never had before. And she carried that without hesitation, without complaint, without making him feel small for needing it. But the loss was doing something else beneath all of this. Something quieter and more lasting. It was changing him. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But in the small shifts that only the people closest to him could detect, the difference between who he had been before and who he was slowly becoming. He grew more reflective. Less caught up in the noise around him. More likely to pause, to sit with things rather than rush past them. The urgency that had once driven his days began to feel much smaller when placed next to what he had just been through. Losing a parent carries a specific kind of weight that nothing else does. A parent is often the person who existed in your life before anything else, before the career, before the public image, before the version of yourself the world came to know. When that person is gone, something shifts in how you understand your own place in the world. And for Mark, the career, the public profile, all the demands that came with it, they became easier to put into perspective once something genuinely irreplaceable had been taken away. He was not broken by it. But he was changed. Quietly and permanently. And the world watching from the outside felt every bit of it. There is something particular about watching someone you have seen on television for years go through something genuinely painful. It does not feel the same as reading about a stranger. It feels closer than that. Mark had been a familiar face for a long time. People had watched him across different chapters of his career, followed the milestones of his family life, grown comfortable with his presence in a way that audiences do with people they feel they have come to know. So when news of the loss spread, the reaction was not the usual brief flicker of celebrity sympathy. People were genuinely affected. They shared their own experiences of losing a parent. They found something in his story that had nothing to do with fame at all. That is what happens when grief is handled honestly and without performance. It stops being about who the person is and starts being about what they are going through. And losing a parent is one of the most universally understood forms of pain that exists, because almost every person has faced it or knows they eventually will. Mark had never been the kind of public figure who performed emotion for attention. And that quiet authenticity was exactly why people responded the way they did. They did not just feel sorry for him. They saw themselves in him. But the most powerful part of this story is not the sadness. It is what the loss ultimately left behind. Because grief, at its strangest and most unexpected, teaches things that nothing else can. Not success, not experience, not even time itself. And the lesson Mark was left with was simple but not easy to sit with. Fame means very little when the people who shaped you are no longer there. All the achievements, the recognition, the years of hard work, none of it filled the space his father had left behind. And that realization landed quietly but permanently. He began leaning more heavily into the relationships still around him. His wife. His children. The people his father had always encouraged him to hold close. He became more intentional. More present. Less willing to let the noise of work pull his attention away from what actually mattered. There is an emotional understanding that only arrives through loss. It cannot be borrowed from someone else or absorbed from the outside. It has to be lived through. And Mark was living through it quietly, without any announcement, simply becoming someone who understood more clearly what life was actually for. He stopped waiting for the right moment to be fully present. Because his father's passing had shown him plainly that the right moment is never guaranteed. Fame is a strange thing. It can make a person seem untouchable, as if the ordinary heartbreaks that visit everyone else somehow pass right by the people living in the public eye. But they do not. They never do. And Mark Consuelos at 55 was a quiet reminder of exactly that. Underneath the career and the television appearances and the familiar face, there was simply a man facing one of the hardest things any person can go through: the loss of a parent. The kind of absence that does not fill back in no matter how much time passes or how full life becomes around it. What his father's passing forced him to confront was something most people spend their lives avoiding. That time moves whether you are paying attention or not. That the people who shaped you will not always be there. That no level of success can slow any of that down. He kept going. He leaned on Kelly. He held his family close. He carried the grief in the quiet and steady way that had always defined him. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just honestly, and with as much grace as the pain would allow. Because this was never really a celebrity story. It was a human one. About love, and loss, and time, and the people who shape us into who we are long before the world ever gets to meet us.